discussing extensions in BP debate, which can be one of the more difficult aspects of British parliamentary because there are often disagreements as to what a good extension should look like, how to avoid derivative extensions, and how to weigh extensions. But broadly speaking, an extension speech should contain either new material or new arguments and should reframe and impact the round. The burden on closing is to essentially prove that your extension was relevant, impactful, new, and actually got to the core of what the debate should be about. Do during prep when you're on closing, but the most important thing to keep in mind is to always be flexible because you don't know what the clash of the debate is going to be about or what points your opening is going to take from you until you've actually heard their speeches. But there are a few things you can do during prep. One thing you can do is broadly brainstorm what the core point of the debate is. So you're trying to figure out what the debate is trying to solve, and does this motion or do these mechanisms actually solve it? You can also brainstorm the burdens on Gov and Op and what they have to prove to win this debate, as well as try to figure out why the CA team set this motion and what they're actually trying to get at. Other things you can do during prep is think about different actors that are going to be affected by this motion, as well as the short-term versus long-term impacts of it, and other things like this. Further, you can also list points that you and your partner can think of that will apply to this round. You don't have to flesh out all of these points because the good news is that when you're on closing, you have more time to actually write your case and write your extension during the opening half of the debate. So sometimes you can even think of a new extension during the debate itself. Of extensions that you can go with when you're on closing. So the first one, which are new points or new arguments, which is pretty self-explanatory. In this case, you just have new arguments that opening didn't cover. And when it on the next slide about opening versus closing clashes, I'll get into more about reframing and weighing and explaining why explicitly your points are the most important in the round and why they should be weighed over your opening. But secondly, another type of extension is mechanisms. So if your opening gave good points that you were going to give, but their points were based on assertions or lacked mechanisms that sort of left holes that made it either easy for your opposition to take down or made their case sort of confusing and left gaps there, you can give new mechanisms and explicitly define those mechanisms and what your opening was missing. So in this case, you would just be explaining why they would actually achieve the motion and how this motion would be achieved. The third type of extension is impacting. So similar to mechanisms, this is just filling in the holes of your opening halves. Speech. So similar to mechanisms, if your opening gives like broad points for their case, but often misses important impacts that explain why this is important, you can take their arguments and impact them and explain the importance of these effects or impacts and illustrate the consequences of these. And you can also explain that without these impacts, for example, opening's case would broadly just rely on principles and doesn't explain why this motion or why this mechanism is especially pernicious or good. The third type of extension that you'll often see in BP debate is after extension. So this often looks like just explaining different groups that are affected by this motion, right? So in the scenario of after extensions, you would just be picking a group that's affected by the motion and explaining why it would either be good or bad for them and why that matters. So you would explain that the impact on the specific actor would be disproportional to the motion that is being proposed and why that matters. So common actors are often women, minorities, disenfranchised groups, etc. And pitching a different actor can often help you come up with new arguments as well. The last type of extension you can go with are rebuttal extensions, and this is often something that should be used as a last resort if you have been turf burned by your opening and you can't come up with any new extension points. So in this case, with rebuttal extensions, what you want to do is reframe your rebuttal into constructive and build the rebuttal into a counterfactual and do a bit of world building to explain the more likely scenario on the opposite side. So you would explain that, for example, the benefits that your opposition bench claims are actually harms. And if you're doing a rebuttal extension, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the rebuttal has to be things that opening already didn't refute or say. And with rebuttal extensions, you want to refute the most impactful points in this debate and spend time explaining your rebuttal. And this is often something that's for rebuttals in general. Don't just go with the low hanging fruits, but actually spend time thinking about the most significant or impactful points that your opposition bench gave and try to refute those. Important things you can do when you're an extension speaker is to clearly define yourself against your opening. And this is one of the ways in which you're in your speech in which you can come out over your opening, and you can also avoid being derivative. So the first point that you should do is to define your extension explicitly against your opening and to explain how it's unique. So even if it's, for example, like the mechanism or impact extensions that we previously talked about, it's important to explicitly signpost this for your judges and explain why those missing mechanisms or impacts, for example, were important and why you should come out above your opening because of that. Because oftentimes without that explicit weighing, judges can often be left confused as to what you uniquely contributed as a team. The second thing you should do is reframe the round to explain why your point or actors are the most impactful in the context of the round. And under this framework, explain firstly how your points fit in and why they're important, and secondly, frame out your opening to explain why they're irrelevant or don't matter as much. So reframing can look like, for example, in a motion about in liberal democracies, this house would implement its social credit system. If opening just talked about principles and why this is principally unjust, closing can then talk about the goal of implementing this and why this goal wouldn't be achieved by looking at the practical impacts of this motion. So your framing should be framing this debate under the framework of the goal of the implementation and explaining why, for example, this would be counterproductive towards achieving that goal, and then weigh the practical impacts against principles and essentially prove why principles don't matter as long as the goal isn't achieved, or that principles sort of are a bit irrelevant throughout this round. The last thing you should do is weighing. So given the framing, you should explicitly weigh your extension against your opening and against other teams in the round and prove why your extension matters the most in this debate.